All right, let's talk about this for a second because I mentioned it at the end of my video and maybe a lot of people didn't catch that. But you know, all this deficit hysteria, which is completely ridiculous and unfounded, and it's just absolutely based on, just sheer hysterical fear, all right? The deficit, most people don't know this, but the deficit in 1943, when the United States was involved in World War II, the deficit went up to 34% of GDP. 34% of GDP, if that was the deficit today, that would be a deficit of almost 7 trillion. A deficit of almost 7 trillion, okay? If you compare it to the deficit that we had, which everybody was getting crazy about in 2009 when we had the financial crash, that was about 10% of GDP at the time. That was 1.5 trillion. The deficit right now is 3.4% of GDP. It's about 650 billion, okay? So the deficit in 1943 was 34% of GDP, the equivalent of a deficit that would be 7 trillion today, all right? And that deficit in 1943, that didn't bankrupt the nation, it didn't impoverish us, it didn't create hyperinflation. As a matter of fact, it made our country rich. That deficit spending resulted in the creation of factories and infrastructure and payments of wages and salaries to workers, and we fought the war with the help of allies. Of course, we must mention Russia. Really, Russia was the victor, or the reason why the war in Europe came to an end. But we fought a war. When you think about it, a lot of the capital that was created as a result of that deficit spending, that was military hardware and materiel, a lot of it was blown up on the battlefield. So yes, it was necessary in waging war, but imagine if all of that was used to, create more infrastructure, education, basic science and research, healthcare. I mean, if you think about it, a deficit of that size now, you cure cancer, you probably find the cure for cancer in 2-3 months and all these terrible diseases. But that's what happened. And, all of us, the current generation, we are still living off of that bounty from, the generation in the past. That went to savings, which were passed along from one generation to another generation. It went to, like I said before, the building of factories and production facilities, which were eventually retooled for civilian production and consumer goods. So, we are still living off of, listen, I go to the beach in the summertime out here in New York, Jones Beach. That road, and it says right there when you get on that road, that was built during the Depression in 1934. I'm still, making use of that capital, that physical infrastructure that was built, 80-something years ago, 83 years ago, through deficit spending. I'm making use of that capital every summer to take me out to some of the most beautiful beaches here on Long Island. So there you have it, folks. The deficit is not a drain on us. It is a bounty for us. It is an addition to our financial wealth and, the way it is spent, how it is put to use. That deficit could also be an addition to our real wealth, our real capital. And that's certainly what happened during World War II in 1934. So when people start complaining about the deficit is a bounty. It does not detract. It adds to the non-government, all right? We went up to 34% of GDP. That would be the equivalent of a $7 trillion deficit today. And we're getting all upset about a $650 billion deficit. And we're still, all of us are still living off of the real wealth that was created as a result of that deficit spending. So there you have it. That's just a fact. So all this hysteria, that's just what it is. It is ignorance. Total ignorance. That's what it is. Bye, everybody.